How would you judge the strength of multilateral ties today in combating terrorism? What do those look like? What do those relationships look like today?
Actually surprisingly good. It may not seem that way to the general public, but last June, the General Assembly had its 7th review of the global counterterrorism strategy, and they voted unanimously on a new resolution which enhances our mandate in the UN Office of Counterterrorism and the role of the UN in fighting terrorism around the world. Member states have the main responsibility for implementing the strategy, but they've asked us to help support them, and particularly they enhanced issues related to civil society, human rights, gender, areas that seem under assault in some parts of the world, but the world came together to say these things are important. They also focused on the relatively new phenomenon of terrorism based on xenophobia, racism, other forms of intolerance, where it's based on religion or other belief, what some people might call far right-wing terrorism. It's not an accurate description, but that's a big trend. And then, of course, the persistent threat posed by Al-Qaeda and Daesh, which has spread in Africa and receded in other places, but still the biggest threat that is faced in terrorism today. But everyone agrees on that. That's the good news. And even in the Security Council, there is general agreement on the topic of countering terrorism, if not in specific countries, at least the theme. So we have a very strong foundation upon which to build. And there are some results to demonstrate that. For example, for about the 3rd or 4th year in a row, the number of deaths globally from terrorism has continued to decline. That's a little bit misleading. If you're living in Africa, it doesn't look like that at all because the numbers are going up there, but in overall numbers, it's going down. So we are having some successes, and those successes are based on multilateral cooperation. So we're in a good place now, and I'm comfortable that we have the tools that we need for the next year. The headwinds we're walking into politically are a different matter, but right now the collective sense of multilateral action against counterterrorism is still very much sound.
How has the pandemic disrupted those relationships and multilateralism and the progress that's being made, I suppose the speed of progress?
Well, in very practical terms, of course, a lot of countries had to shift the focus, both in terms of their policies and their resources, to fighting the pandemic. And in some cases, that could affect security operations. In some cases, it created a sort of insular or national inward focus on countries, again, which is understandable, but it's counterintuitive to work multilaterally. Those are the best ways of responding to a global pandemic, of course. So that's at the meta level of what the pandemic did on a very practical scale. Whereas countries shifted focus, the terrorists did not. They did not pull back from fighting. In fact, they used it as an opportunity to expand, particularly in places like Africa. Restrictions on travel, ironically, have diminished the number of what we'd call external operations, people traveling from conflict zones to other areas to commit terrorist acts. But there could be a bottle up and release effect as travel restrictions are eased over COVID. So we're very much on the lookout for that.
Was there any uptick as a result of the pandemic, and as you say, that travel reducing in instances of something like cyber terrorism, of course, which isn't confined by those boundaries?
Not so much cyber terrorism in the sense that cyber means used to commit terrorism. Like we've seen, you're probably aware, there have been instances where cyber actors gain control of machinery and that sort of stuff. We have seen not so much of that per se, but certainly a lot of activity online, particularly in the area of radicalization and recruitment. So many people, of course, shifted to spend more time online as a result of the pandemic, as lockdowns and so on. That affected youth perhaps disproportionately. We've seen a growth in online video gaming as a platform for messaging and recruitment, particularly by these XRI groups, the xenophobia, racism, other forms of intolerance, as a way of grooming people, determining potential recruits, preparing for attacks, like using war-type games as like virtual forms of training and that sort of thing. So that's something that has increased, and of course the propaganda and recruiting by Daesh and Al-Qaeda is still persistent in that regard too.
And how has the conflicts that we're seeing at the moment influence the kind of threat landscape and the opportunity for terrorism to emerge in certain parts of the world?
Well, it has take the conflict in the war in Ukraine, for example, is very clearly a lot of world's focus is understandably placed there right now, but it has knock-on effects in places, particularly in Africa, where there is an ongoing threat from Daesh-affiliated groups such as so-called Islamic State Central Africa province. Ukrainian peacekeepers are removing some of their helicopters from the peacekeeping force there to bring them back to Ukraine, and that diminishes, for at least a period of time, the firepower that UN forces have to take on some of these groups when they're attacked by them. So that's the kind of consequence we have. And then we also see stuff going on in the Sahel and Western Africa, which preceded the war in Ukraine, that also see a shifting, a movement of particularly Western forces out of the theater and moving into areas in the periphery. So it's quite possible that the situation there might get worse in the near term as these now military-led regimes in Burkina Faso and Mali grapple with the consequences of their form of government leading to problems with the United Nations and others being able to cooperate them in these circumstances.
Let's look at the forum now. How important are events like this, opportunities like this, bringing people together to combating, these kind of issues that we see affecting the world globally? How important are these discussions to be had?
Well, terrifically useful, frankly. I mean, first of all, a lot of business gets done on the side. You bump into people, and opportunities are identified and seized upon. I've met a number of colleagues of mine from the U.S. government I used to work for, but also people from the Balkans and elsewhere. We have a great relationship with the state of Qatar. It's one of our biggest supporters of the UN Office of Counterterrorism. In fact, I don't think we could do any of the things that we were mandated by the General Assembly to do without Qatar's support. And so we take advantage of our presence here at the Doha Forum to have a strategic dialogue that I just came from. We're having a beneficiaries forum where we bring representatives of the countries that we've been able to help with the assistance of Qatar to come here and describe the impact that we're having. And then, of course, the subject matter is broad and timely and topical, and it's very interesting to me as an international affairs specialist.